Victoria's Premier Daniel Andrews is speaking and giving evidence to the hotel quarantine. Here were some of the highlights from the inquiry.
Please raise the Bible in your right hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God.
That the evidence I shall give.
That the evidence I shall give.
Will be the truth.
Will be the truth.
The whole truth.
The whole truth.
And nothing but the truth.
And nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Premier. If you could put the Bible down now and I'll hand you to Ms Elliard. Thanks, Ms Elliard.
Premier, I wanted to ask you first some questions about the state of affairs that existed prior to 27 March when the decision was taken by National Cabinet to establish a program for mandatory quarantine. Premier, are you able to see that? Is it large enough for you?
Yes, it is.
This is a direction given by the Deputy Chief Health Officer in exercise of powers that were available because of the state of emergency that had been declared on the 16th of March.
Yes.
And in particular, this is a direction that was issued requiring that returned travellers on and from the 18th of March 2020, as we see in paragraph 4, isolate at home for a period of 14 days after their return to Australia.
Yes.
And we see, if we go to, perhaps I'll ask Mr Operator if paragraph 4 could be enlarged for the direction that was made required a person to travel to a premises suitable for them to remain and reside there except in exceptional circumstances and leave only in the limited circumstances set out there.
Yes.
Is that so?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr Operator. That can come from the screen. Can I then also call for a second document? This, as I understand it, Premier, is another direction made by the Deputy Chief Health Officer, which applied to those persons who had been diagnosed with novel coronavirus to isolate at home for a period of 14 days.
Yes, I believe it is.
And that, as we see from paragraph 3, took effect from the 25th of March 2020.
Yes.
And as I understand it, whilst there might have been variations from time to time, it's remained the position that those who are in the community and who have been diagnosed with COVID-19 have been subject to a direction in this form requiring them to isolate at home.
Yes, that is correct.
Unless they required medical care, in which case they've been taken to hospital.
Yes, Ms Elliott.
Thank you, Mr Operator. That can come from the screen. Premier, at paragraphs 23, 24 and 27 of your statement, and by all means look at it if you would like to, you refer to one thing that you were aware of in the period leading up to 27 March, which in your mind had some relevance to the steps that should be taken and that were taken by National Cabinet on the 27th of March. And that is your awareness of reports, at least reports on the 23rd of March by the then Chief Commissioner of Police, that there were instances of non-compliance with the first direction that we looked at, the direction that required returned travellers to stay at home.
Yes.
And were those reports of which you were aware reports made by Mr Ashton to the media, or were they reports that had been made directly to you, or perhaps both?
Both, I think, Ms Elliott. I was aware of those media reports, and beyond that I understood that there were other details, other reports as to non-compliance.
Thank you. So we see here, Premier, an $80 million accommodation package to support key workers and provide emergency accommodation to people in need.
Yes, we do.
And as I understand what's written there, it was proposed that the government would use the money that had been allocated to reserve up to 30% of current hotel rooms for a period of 3 months and negotiate appropriate arrangements.
Yes.
It's come to be known as the Hotels for Heroes program, I think, or formed part of a broader suite of COVID emergency accommodation.
Yes, it has been referred in those terms.
Yes, and we see in the green box there towards the right-hand side, there's a heading there to fiscal impact and a reference to it being of benefit to businesses.
Yes.
And would I be right in understanding that that was because it was recognised that funding allocation of this kind was going to serve a dual purpose, securing appropriate accommodation and supporting a sector that was particularly affected by coronavirus restrictions?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. Prior to the 27th of March, Premier, had you been given any specific advice about the powers that were available to the Victorian government to detain people for the purposes of quarantine?
I'm not certain that I had received any specific advice, Ms. Elliard, on that question, other than a general understanding of the provisions of the Public Health and Wellbeing Act.
Thank you. May I turn then to the question of how the decision for hotel quarantine came to, or designated locations quarantine came to be made, and perhaps direct your attention to paragraphs 12 and following in your statement, Premier. You refer in those paragraphs to receiving a brief on the morning of the 27th of March from the Department of Premier and Cabinet. As I understand it, Mr. Andrews, what you've produced here is the relevant extract from the briefing that you received ahead of the National Cabinet meeting that was to occur later that day.
Yes.
There was also provided to you a written advice from the AHPPC, which made a recommendation that consideration be given to requiring people to quarantine away from home in high risk cases.
Yes, that was the substance of it. Yes, Ms. Elliott.
And did you understand what was meant by the term high risk as it was used by the AHPPC?
I think there was some explanation as to that, but of course these would inform a meeting that would occur later on that day. I can't be certain that I had a precise understanding of what that term meant before the meeting.
Did you have your own views as at this time of what high risk meant if we're thinking about returned travellers coming from places where there might have been coronavirus infections?
Yes.
What was your own view of what we might describe people as high risk?
Anybody returning from a country with little or no public health response, community transmission, posed, in my judgment, a very serious risk, perhaps even an unacceptable risk for community transmission here. And I think the circumstance that we confronted at that time, with the vast majority of cases coming from overseas, that would have informed that view.
Having regard to your pre-existing awareness of some work being done for the procuring of hotel rooms, did you have an assumption or an expectation after this decision was taken that the designated facilities in Victoria would be hotels?
I thought that most likely, Ms. Elliard, for a number of reasons. I'm happy to elaborate if you think that would be of assistance.
Yes. Why was, to the extent that you had the assumption that in Victoria we'd be using hotels, why was that?
Well, firstly, I'd been informed and had a general sense that there were the thousands of hotel rooms that would be required, as was referred to in the Cabinet document you brought up earlier. From the 20th, I believe, was the date of that meeting. And beyond that, it seemed logical that hotels would perhaps be the facility used, given travelling parties are made up of different numbers of people, so you'd need different size rooms. You'd need separate bathrooms for the purposes of infection control. Those sorts of factors, I think, were on my mind at that time. We hadn't settled the matter, but hotels did seem logical.
And when was the matter settled for Victorian purposes?
Well, I think I made announcements on the 28th. I believe that's when I made announcements about the final nature of things, or at least provided further details. And by that stage, I would recall that I think that the issue of hotels had been settled by then.
Okay. And I take it, you may feel you've already said this, Premier, but one reason why hotels were a sensible option was that there were plenty of them available at this time, having regard to the limitations that had been placed on travel and tourism.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. At the time that you were party to or present for the decision of National Cabinet, did you have an understanding yourself of the enforcement power that would be used in Victoria to require people to remain in quarantine?
I can't specifically recall whether Ms. Elliott could point to a particular provision in the Act, but I suppose looking back on it, my assumption would have been those powers that were being used to essentially quarantine people in their homes.
Okay, so you assumed that it would be an extension of those powers under the Public Health and Wellbeing Act?
Yes, I think that would have been the assumption I made, yes.
About who was going to enforce or monitor compliance. At the time you made, were party to the decision or were aware that the decision had been made, did you have a view yourself about how those powers that were going to be exercised were going to be monitored and, where necessary, enforced?
No, I did not. That would not be a matter that I would turn my mind to.
I understand, Premier, that this document has been provided to us as a text exchange passing between a member of your private office, who is the person writing the texts in grey, and Mr. Ada, who is a Deputy Secretary at the Department of Premier and Cabinet. I'll just give you a moment to read that, and then once you've read to the bottom, I'll ask for the next page where the text exchange continues.
Yes, I've read that, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you. Mr. Operator, could we have the next page, please, so that we can see the rest?
Yes, I've read that, Ms. Elliott.
Thank you, Premier. We'll go back to the first page, please, if we may, Mr. Operator. This, as I understand it, is, we can see the time stamping, it's 19 minutes past 1, which, as we understand from other evidence, would have been quite shortly after the conclusion of the National Cabinet meeting. Does that match your recollection?
Yes, it does.
And there's a reference here, we will need something on food and security for people in hotels. And the discussion goes on. It appears that it's partly about whether the program would start that day or the next day. But does this email, we will need something on food and security for people in hotels, suggest any decisions being made by you or in your private office about what the model was going to be?
I think my answer is no. I think it identifies that there's a need and that those matters have not yet been finalised. Not at that time anyway, Ms. Elliott.
Would it have been within your private office that decisions of this kind would have been made about the model that was going to be adopted for the program?
No, they're very much indeed, they're a deeply operational matter that would not be determined by my office or indeed by my department. I would say that would be out of character. We have emergency management structures and agencies for exactly those purposes.
Okay, so it does appear, though, that relevant matters, or what this member of your staff perceived as relevant matters, were being raised with Mr. Ada.
I think for the purposes of what I would be announcing, that's what I read this to mean, not so much to be determining them.
Thank you. There's a reference in the blue writing to Simon. Do you think it's likely that Simon might be a reference to Mr. Femister, the Secretary to the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions?
Yes, I think that's likely, more than likely.
Thank you, Premier. Thank you, Mr. Operator. That can come from the screen. I was taking you to some documentation produced by Mr. Ashton. Mr. Ashton has given evidence that this was a text message that he sent to Mr. Eccles, the Secretary to the Department of Premier and Cabinet. The timestamping is 1:16, and it suggests by its content that Mr. Ashton had received some information about a proposal that would involve people being guarded by police. Are you aware at about this time, 16 minutes past 1, of any such proposal?
Yes, that is what it seems he's saying. And no, I wasn't aware of a proposal at that time.
Thank you. The text messaging suggests that within a very short period of time after the sending of that message that we've just looked at, Mr. Ashton had come into the possession of information suggesting that it would be private security guarding at the hotels. And it appears to have been informed or drawn an inference that that was an arrangement that had been made by the Department of Premier and Cabinet. If I can draw your attention to the second green box there, which is a text sent at 1:22. Perhaps I'll ask that it be enlarged a bit, please, Mr. Operator.
Yes, I can see that, Ms. Elliott.
Yes. And then a little bit further down, Mr. Operator, if we go to the further message in green, more toward the bottom of the page, there's a reference there at 132 to Mr. Ashton, apparently at that time having an understanding that it was a deal set up by the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Same question again. Are you aware of any such proposal having been agreed upon at about 1:30 that private security would be used for the purposes of enforcing mandatory self-isolation?
No, Ms. Elliott.
Are you aware of any circumstances that might have been a basis for Mr. Ashton to have received that information or received that impression that a decision had been made?
No, I'm not aware of anything personally that would have given rise to Graham Ashton drawing those conclusions.
Thank you.
No.
That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. The board has received evidence, Premier, from Minister Neville and Mr. Ashton that they each had an understanding by about 2 o'clock when they were in a meeting with Mr. Crisp, the Emergency Management Commissioner, that there had been a decision taken already and that the decision was that private security would be used. Evidence was not only that they were aware that a decision had been taken, but that they themselves had not been consulted about the proposal. They were rather presented with it as the decision that had been made. It'll be a matter for the board to consider whether or not to accept that evidence, but assuming that to be the case, does it strike you as unusual that a decision about enforcement would have been made without consulting the Chief Commissioner of Police or the Police Minister?
That would certainly not accord with custom and practice that I've observed throughout my time in public life and throughout my time as a Minister of the Crown and throughout my time as the Premier of this state. And indeed,
it would, by reason of it being inappropriate, would you regard it as unlikely?
I wouldn't necessarily. I'm not sure that I advanced the notion that it was not appropriate. It would be out of character. It would not be the normal practice that I've certainly observed over a long period of time. Ms. Elliott, if I understand your question, would it be out of character?
I think my question is, and perhaps I put words in your mouth, Premier. So firstly, I should ask you, do you think it's appropriate that a decision of that kind would be taken without consultation with the Chief Commissioner of Police?
It certainly would be very unusual, unprecedented, I think, in some ways. I'm not sure that I'm in a position to make a value judgment about it, but by virtue of it not being regular practice, that would not be certainly from my point of view, that would not be the preferred way to set up a program like this.
And so may I take it that, having regard to your experience, you would expect that ordinarily the views of the Chief Commissioner of Police would be sought before any decision was reached about the form of enforcement to be used in a program such as this?
That's certainly my experience.
And thank you. May I turn to a different set of questions about the reasons why the decision was taken and its implications, that being the decision to have a quarantine program?
Yes.
Would I be right in understanding that the objective of the program that was agreed to by National Cabinet was to prevent the transmission of infection from returned travellers to others in the community?
Yes.
And thinking particularly about Victoria, the purpose of implementing the program in Victoria was to prevent such transmission within Victoria?
Yes.
And it was your assessment, as I understand your statement, that at this time, on the 27th of March, you foresaw a significant risk to the Victorian community if returning travellers who were COVID positive transmitted the infection to contacts and beyond into the community.
Yes, I did.
Did you yourself, on this day, give consideration to the possibility of other less extreme measures, such as, for example, beefing up the monitoring of people who were isolating at home?
I'm sure I would have turned my mind to those matters, Ms. Elliott, but I think in some respects the notion of having a very large group of people in a more concentrated environment would make compliance and enforcement from at least in a policy sense an easier task. The other thing as well, of course, to note is that we couldn't be certain how many people that would, actual Victorians who were in Victoria, who had not travelled, who might become positive. So it seemed an appropriate response to a very significant risk at a time when we were trying to buy time to prepare our health system, and a time when we were expecting that things would unfold much like they had in some other parts of the world.
I understand. Thinking about the particular legislative context in Victoria where the Charter of Human Rights and Responsibilities provides for certain mechanisms and considerations, did you think about that particular Victorian context and the extent to which it might affect the way in which the National Cabinet decision could be implemented in Victoria?
No, I didn't turn my mind to the Charter, but many of the issues that are contemplated in the Charter would have been important to me, I think.
So would it be fair to say, and perhaps picking up the language of the press conference that we've looked at, that it was your assessment that it would be too risky to rely on people self-isolating on a, quote, honesty basis?
Yes.
And would you agree that you've mentioned the benefits that flow in compliance terms, perhaps from people being in a large facility altogether, but putting a whole lot of people who may or may not have the disease in close proximity to each other creates its own risks too, doesn't it?
Yes, it does.
So the risk that they might expose each other to infection, for example?
Yes.
Or the risk that that the workers who are needed to come in to resource and manage a quarantine program might be exposed to infection.
Yes.
And what became clear was that this was a system that did require quite a large number of supports and a large number of people so as to make the program work.
Yes.
It was as the board understands it from all of the evidence we've received, a very complicated system.
Certainly a very large system, Ms. Elliard. As to arrangements and their complexity, I probably can't speak to that, but it was certainly a very big task. And whilst some of those risks can be mitigated, they are very, very significant issues.
Do you think on the 27th, when forming your own view that this was an appropriate process for Victoria, you had a sense of how large it was?
I think I did. We had some information about how many people had come back and some, at least, difficult to be definitive about exactly how many will come back, but we had some sense of that, and we thought we had the sufficient stock of rooms. Beyond that, I suppose I may well, in fact, I'm certain I would have left some of the risk mitigations we've just discussed to those at an operational level. I don't know that I would have turned my mind to those matters.
And so when I'm using the word large, I don't just mean number of rooms, but also large in the sense of all of the various logistical pieces that would need to be put together at an operational level.
Yes, I think that's a fair way to describe it, yes.
But it's also expensive in dollar terms when one considers the cost of hotel rooms and the costs of all the other ancillary services that are required to make the program work.
Yes, it is a considerable expense.
Would we be right in understanding from the press conference that you gave on the 27th of March that, at least to some extent, the cost, particularly the cost of hotel rooms, was one of the reasons why this was a good option, because it was going to be making use of the hotel rooms and potentially providing some work for people who'd been displaced by COVID restrictions?
Ms. Elliard, you, I think, spoke in terms of perhaps multiple benefits earlier on. So I think that there was potentially and likely a multiple benefit. The other point I would make is, as I look back on that time, even at $80 million, which is a substantial amount of money, the costs associated both in lives, liberties and finances of widespread community transmission and this wildly infectious virus running as it had in so many other parts of the world, I dare say they were considerable factors for me and for us at the time as well.
Are you able to recall what level of briefing you received about the way the structure had been established and who was doing what?
Certainly ahead of my announcements in the immediate aftermath of National Cabinet, that 28th, I think, is the appropriate date, where we spoke in more detailed terms. I would have been briefed on decisions that had been made by that time. Beyond that, I can't point to a specific document or specific meeting, but logic tells me that must have occurred because I made announcements to that end on the 28th.
Do you think the documentation or briefings that you received would have gone into detail about, for example, which agency or agencies were taking responsibility for the establishment and maintenance of the program?
I would expect, if we're speaking about agencies rather than departments, Ms. Elliott, is that?
Thank you for the correction. I should say department. Which departments were involved?
Not a correction. I just wanted to be clear on what I was being asked.
No, departments.
Departments. I might have had some sense of departmental arrangements, but I think agency arrangements, I would not necessarily be briefed specifically on that. It might come forward perhaps as something that the State Control Centre had done, maybe trying to, if you like, grouping together different agencies.
So, for example, you say later at a certain point in your statement who you understood to be the agency that had the control agency responsibility under emergency management arrangements. Do you recall when or how you became aware that there was a control agency with responsibility for this particular operation, namely the hotel quarantine program?
Beyond my statement, I can't speak necessarily to, as I said, a specific document. And I suppose it relates to the time frame. Very early on, I can't speak to that, but then these matters became formalised as they were the subject of cabinet submissions, the one you've just taken me to, I think, from the 8th.
Yes. So I'm going to take you to a document and ask you if you recall seeing it or any earlier iterations of it. Just showing you the front page there, Premier. Are you able to say whether this is a document that you've seen before?
I don't believe I've seen that document before, Ms. Elliott.
As we go through the pages, one sees that it's a document that sets out with some detail the way in which roles and responsibilities have been apportioned between departments for the purposes of the hotel quarantine program. Would you ordinarily expect to receive documentation of this kind in your capacity as the Premier?
No, I wouldn't. And my point of reference, I suppose, Ms. Elliott, would be that I don't believe that I would have received documentation of this kind, even for a bushfire. I don't believe, thinking back across the summer, I don't believe I would have seen a document of this nature.
Okay. Thank you. Can we go through to page within that document 9229, so .9229, please, Mr. Operator. I'm drawing your attention to the section in the document dealing with governance, Premier, and I'm conscious that you've said that you don't believe you've seen this and it isn't a category of documents that you would ordinarily expect to receive. But we see there, perhaps we'll make it a little bit larger, Mr. Operator, for the benefit of everybody's eyes. If we can focus on the governance section, 2.1.
Yes.
There's a reference there to the operation being led by the Deputy State Controller working to the State Controller Health to give effect to the decisions and directions of the Public Health Commander and the Enforcement and Compliance Commander. And there's also reference to support agencies. Thinking about your experience in other kinds of emergencies, including bushfires, Premier, are you aware in general terms of the concept of control agency and support agency for emergency management purposes?
Yes, Ms. Elliott.
And you're also aware that wasn't the approach that was taken for the purposes of the public health emergency in Victoria this year. Someone else was appointed as the State Controller for Health?
Yes.
And are you aware of the opinion of the Chief Health Officer, which he's given to the board in the course of his evidence, that in his view it would have been appropriate, or I think his words might have been not inappropriate, for him to have been the State Controller Health?
Ms Elliott, I'm aware of that evidence. I'm aware of that view now. I was not aware of that at the time when I think these matters were live, as it were.
And of course, one obvious effect of the Chief Health Officer being the State Controller for Health is that he would have had a direct role being reported to and with the capacity to deal directly with the person holding the position of Deputy State Controller for Operation Soteria.
You could certainly argue that, yes.
As we understand the evidence, Premier, one of the changes that was made to government and ministerial arrangements to reflect the demands of the COVID-19 pandemic was not just the reorganisation of Cabinet to form the Crisis Council of Cabinet, but a corresponding change in the way in which the secretaries of departments were given responsibilities and reported on those responsibilities as they related to COVID-19.
Yes.
And we understand that was called the mission... I've gone back. The EMCC.
Yes.
Yeah. And you were, by reason of that arrangement, being reported to directly by a number of mission leads within departments, as well as them having a reporting line to their own minister. Is that right?
Yes. Yes.
And in that capacity, the special arrangements that were in place for COVID-19, would you have expected, or did you receive a higher degree of operational detail about matters relating to COVID-19 response than you would ordinarily get as Premier?
No, those arrangements didn't alter the fundamental division between those matters that the executive would normally deal with and those deeply operational matters that are appropriately dealt with by others.
So although you had a more direct line to some secretaries and they had a more direct line to you, that wouldn't have altered the extent to which you were given operational information about how, particularly for our purposes, the quarantine program was being run?
No.
So would you have received such information, for example, as decisions having been made about which hotels to use?
I don't believe so, no.
Would you have received information about decisions that had been made to allocate a particular hotel as a place which would be called a hot hotel at which everyone who tested positive would be located?
I don't believe so. I certainly have no recall of a specific document or a briefing to that matter. I was aware of those arrangements, but that may well be that I've become aware of it rather than it being put to me almost to say yes or no to that sort of arrangement. Secretaries are all employed by me, they're appointed by me, and they're already accountable. This was about trying to streamline some of that, but it didn't change the types of things that secretaries would ordinarily be accountable to me for.
Thank you. That can come from the screen, Mr. Operator. I want to turn to ask you some questions about contracting arrangements at a fairly high level, Premier. The evidence that the board's received is that the state government, through the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, entered into a number of contracts for the purposes of the hotel quarantine program. May I assume that at least at a high level you're familiar with that fact?
Yes.
And are you aware, perhaps even at a very general level, that the contracts with hotels and the contracts with security companies placed responsibility on the contractors for matters relating to correct and sufficient use of personal protective equipment and training for staff on infection prevention and control?
I'm certainly aware of that now, Ms. Elliott. I couldn't speak to whether I was at the time, but yes, the answer to the question is yes.
Yeah. And the evidence that the board has received is from just looking on the face of the contracts, those responsibilities relating to PPE and staff understanding, infection control and so forth, they were outsourced by government to those private contractors, if you just look at the bare face of the contracts.
I think that's a fair statement, yes.
Yeah. And assuming that to be the case, there'd be a very substantial risk associated with that, wouldn't there? By which I mean a risk to the success of the program that such matters had been outsourced.
Yes.
Now, you may be aware that there's been differing views presented to the board about whether or not it was just the bare contractual arrangements or whether or not there was other responsibilities assumed by departments of the state and the extent to which they fulfilled those additional obligations if they existed, and those would be matters for the board to decide. But would you agree with me that these issues of infection control were too important to be left entirely to private contractors?
I think I can agree with that statement. Given what's at stake, given the seriousness and the infectivity of this virus, Ms. Elliott, I think that's a fair statement, yes.
Because, I mean, contractual remedies after the fact would hardly be enough if, by reason of a contractual failure, the infection got out and spread in the community.
Yes, those proceedings are of not much use against this virus.
Thank you. May I turn then to a few more questions about your knowledge of how the enforcement mechanisms worked. And I'm directing your attention to paragraph 41 and following of your statement, Premier, if that assists you. Are you able to recall when you became aware that the front line of enforcement for the program being put in place was going to be private security guards rather than some other mechanism?
Ms. Elliott, I can't point to a specific meeting or document, but I'll take you back to my answer earlier. I announced these arrangements, at least in broad terms, on the 28th. So I must have been informed of those final decisions prior to then.
Okay. Do you recall whether or not you had an opinion at the time you became aware of it about the appropriateness or otherwise of that frontline enforcement role being given to private security?
No, I don't believe. Well, I can't speak to whether I did that. That is some time ago, and I've no recall of having a specific view one way or the other.
Premier, would I be right in understanding that you've been made personally aware in the past of concerns in sections of the community and sections of the private security industry about that industry and how it operates?
Yes.
And indeed, you had previously committed to the conducting of a review of the regulatory and licensing arrangements for the private security industry.
Yes.
The document sets out, does it not, for the purposes of inviting discussion and response, Premier, a number of issues that have been raised as potential issues requiring investigation or action. Doesn't include conclusions about them, it raises concerns for discussion and future analysis. Is that fair?
Yes, that's fair.
And one of them is about the quality of training and assessment practices for those who are going to be licensed as private security guards, and we see a reference to some discussion on the page that's up there. Then if we go over 2 pages, please, Mr. Operator, to page 0025. A separate issue that's been raised that's referred to at the bottom half of the page is concerns about literacy and numeracy skills amongst those who've been licensed as private security guards. In particular, the question of language skills, by which I understand them to mean language skills in the English language.
Yes, I can see that there's a series of questions posed to that end, yes.
Thank you. That can come from the screen. Premier, the evidence that the board has received is that the hotel quarantine program required and used literally thousands of private security guards. Are you aware of that?
I have become aware of that evidence, yes.
And the evidence is that a very substantial majority of them were engaged via subcontracting arrangements underneath head contractors. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And are you aware of the evidence that the security guards were called upon to perform a number of tasks, including, for example, carrying luggage of guests who were arriving or leaving and who may or may not have been COVID positive, escorting guests for fresh air walks in circumstances where they may or may not have been COVID positive, and moving through areas of the hotel that were common areas that could be also used by people who may or may not have been diagnosed or be at risk of having coronavirus. Are you aware of that evidence about the general nature of the duties that security guards performed?
Yes, I am.
there's a substantial risk to the success of this program as an infection control program, I suggest to you, that's associated with such heavy reliance on a private security workforce, having regard to some of the issues that arise about that workforce and how they're hired and remunerated. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think that's a fair conclusion to draw.
And again, that's a risk that particularly arose because of this being a hotel-based rather than home-based quarantine mechanism.
Yes.
And so would you agree that it was a risk for the government to manage as part of, and I'm quoting from paragraph 43 of your statement, Premier, it was a risk for the government to manage as part of its response to a public health emergency caused by a highly infectious virus?
Yes.
Thank you. You say at paragraph 49 and 50 of your statement that you're not yourself aware of offers being made by the ADF. The board has heard evidence that on the 27th of March, in the initial planning meeting that occurred at the State Control Centre, there was some discussion about the extent to which the ADF would play a role, and the Emergency Management Commissioner, Mr. Crisp, says, and gave evidence that this was his view, that he didn't see that on-the-ground ADF assistance was required at that time. Are you aware of that?
Only insofar as I'm aware of the evidence he's given. What was required was not something that I would have been determining, which I think is the sequence of events that you're describing.
Okay. So I take it that, yes, you're aware now that he's given that evidence. You weren't aware at the time that he had that view?
No, I don't believe I was.
In particular, were you aware that there was, well, I should pause there. Mr. Eccles accepted from me that an inference open to be drawn is that the reference to reconsider your operating model is a reference to an operating model that doesn't include ADF. So perhaps to assist you in answering my next question, Mr. Eccles accepted that that's the inference, that the discussion is about a change to a model from one that doesn't include ADF to one that does. Assuming that's what the conversation was about, I take it from your answers that you weren't aware that that discussion had occurred?
No, I was not aware of that.
Were you aware about the proposition that ADF personnel might have been available if Victoria elected to adopt a model that required them in hotels?
No, I had quite the opposite view.
You had the view that they weren't available?
Again, if it's useful to give you some context, I'm happy to do that.
Well, firstly, but just so you had a view that they weren't available. That was your view. And the reason for your view? Well,
and again, I stress this is not as a point of criticism, but leaving the National Cabinet meeting, I had absolutely no expectation whatsoever that in the establishment and the running of hotel quarantine there would be significant, extensive ADF support. That was not the case for every state. A case I think had been well made in relation to New South Wales, but I had no expectation at all that we would receive that type of support. And these matters, some week or so later, were not drawn to my attention. In fact, it's the first time I'm seeing this email. I was in prep for this.
So Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he couldn't recall whether or not he had, well, firstly, I should note that it appears from the face of this document that Mr. Eccles just responded with thanks to Mr. Gaetjens. Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he couldn't recall whether he did or didn't do anything with this information, and that he hadn't been able to find any document by way of an email exchange or anything that would demonstrate that he did do something with it. So that's the evidence Mr. Eccles has given. Would you have ordinarily expected that the availability of a resource of this kind from the ADF would have been drawn to your attention?
Yes.
Do you feel able to express any view on what use you personally might have made of this information had you been aware of it at the time?
It's difficult, Ms. Elliard, for me to speculate on what I might have done with it, but what I think I can comment on is that given that it's so at odds with what I took away from the National Cabinet meeting, I think it would have been very significant to me, and I can't predict what outcome it might have had, but I certainly would have wanted to know, because it would have presented us with options that we otherwise didn't have, in a good faith interpretation, very clear interpretation of what had been decided at National Cabinet.
And amongst other things, and again, I think Mr. Eccles agreed with this proposition, what appears to have been contemplated by Mr. Gaetjens as being available was personnel for whom the Commonwealth would bear financial responsibility.
Yes.
They would pay them.
Yeah, it would be an in-kind arrangement, yes.
Yes. And thus, if they were used, potentially reducing the extent to which Victoria was incurring the costs of private security.
Well, all I'd say is I can't presuppose what role they would have played, but it would be open, I think, to conclude that they might have played some of those functions. I'm not sure, and I can't determine from this email whether they would have been additional to the operating model or whether they might have taken the place of people who were in the operating model. But it's additional support. We could certainly agree on that, I think.
And there's a reference in the in the email that we see here from Mr. Eccles to you having had such a discussion on the previous night, which is the 23rd of June. It appears from the balance of this email, and Mr. Eccles' evidence was that he sent this email by way of a follow-up to a discussion that you and Mr. Morrison had about the possibilities of supports being made available. Is that consistent with your recollection about what the discussion between you and the Prime Minister was?
Yes, it is.
I'll perhaps give you a moment to read the email, and I'll ask that it be made a bit larger for that purpose to see whether it matches your recollection, perhaps at a high level only, of the matters that you and the Prime Minister had discussed.
I am familiar with this matter. All the matters that I discussed with the Prime Minister, to the best of my memory, we did not discuss hotel quarantine, I don't believe. We certainly discussed other matters which are outlined. I can't be certain if that's an absolutely exhaustive list, but they are the matters that we talked about. And I think that, well, again, if you want my view on where the other items came from, I can provide that, but I'm trying to be as clear as I can. I spoke about, I think, all of these issues, with the exception of the topic of hotel quarantine, was not something, I don't believe I spoke to the Prime Minister about that. There's
a figure given of the number of, just a bit further up, there's a figure given of between 50 and 100 personnel.
Yes.
For the purposes. And so, as I understand it, Premier, you don't have a recollection of raising with the Prime Minister the specific issue of support for the hotel quarantine program?
To the best of my recollection, I don't believe I did. I'm not making a judgment about the request. It's not accurate, I think, for me to say that everything in the letter was the subject of the discussion. I don't think that matter was something that we talked about.
Thank you. That can come from the screen. Yes. Bearing in mind, as we discussed earlier, that this whole program involved an assumption of risk and responsibility for managing risk by the government that would otherwise have remained with individuals who were quarantining at home.
Yes.
Would you agree with me, Premier, that the way in which this inquiry has been conducted and the fact of multiple separate government departments being separately represented and in some cases cross-examining each other's witnesses, that speaks to the presence of confusion at multiple levels?
Ms. Elliott, this is the first appearance I've made at an inquiry like this. I'm not a lawyer. I don't know that I could speak to whether that's a good, bad or indifferent thing. My understanding was that those arrangements are business as usual arrangements and are a feature. They have been for a long time. That was at least my understanding. I can't really provide, I don't have a base knowledge of what your profession and these sorts of inquiries look like normally, so I couldn't draw that conclusion.
So if I was to put to you, Premier, that it's not usually the case that separate departments are separately represented and cross-examine each other when there are inquiries of this kind. You wouldn't feel able to proffer an opinion on that for the reasons that you've outlined.
Ms. Elliott, that's certainly different to my understanding. But if you put that to me, and I will assume that that's accurate, and then I might be able to answer your question if you put it to me again.
Yeah, sure. Well, presume for the sake of the question, Mr. Andrews, that it's not usually the case that multiple government departments who've had a role in a matter under investigation are separately represented in the way that multiple departments have been separately represented in this proceeding. Assume from me that it's somewhat unusual. I'm inviting you to respond to my proposition that the fact that that's been seen by those departments to be necessary, it's not a criticism of them for taking that option, but the fact that it seems to have been seen by them to be necessary itself speaks, does it not, to there being different views and confusion within or amongst agencies about aspects of this program.
I think it could be read to mean that, yes, that wouldn't be an unreasonable conclusion to draw. Whether it were accurate or not, I can't speak to that. But
yeah. And the fact that in particular representatives of some departments have, and I'm not suggesting that it was improper, but the fact that representatives of some departments have found it necessary to cross-examine witnesses representing other departments and put to them matters that are plainly in controversy between two or more departments, well, that's evidence itself, isn't it, that although there shouldn't have been confusion, there was. In this program.
Perhaps, Ms. Elliott, if I can answer you this way, leaving the cross-examination and legal practice out of it, the fact that there's not agreement between agencies and departments is not desirable in any way.
Premier, you've been quoted recently, I think, as, and I'm going to be paraphrasing you, so please correct me if I've paraphrased you poorly, but you've been quoted as saying recently that mistakes were made in the program and that those mistakes are unacceptable to you. Those weren't your exact words, but do you recall making remarks to that effect, perhaps in the last week or so?
Yes.
What mistakes were you referring to?
I'm referring to the fact that this was a program designed to stop this wildly infectious virus seeding from return travellers into the Victorian community. That has clearly happened, and that is clearly a failure, and that is clearly the product of at least one error and perhaps multiple errors. I'm not in a position to be able to detail individual errors or mistakes or deficiencies. That is rightly the province of this board, but I'm referring, I think, in more aggregate terms. It was supposed to contain the virus, it didn't. Therefore, something has gone wrong. And I'm basically waiting for this inquiry to provide me with some insights into that.
So you don't yourself have a view on what went wrong?
No, I think I don't have a view. What's more, I don't know that it's appropriate, if I can say, Ms. Elliott, for me to establish an inquiry and then seek to run an inquiry myself. I'm very respectful of this process, and you've looked through 200,000 pages of evidence, 200,000 pages of different documents. You've heard from many, many witnesses. I'm not in a position to do that sort of work, so that's why we set this process up.
Are you aware of a view within your government about what the mistakes were, what the more precise mistakes were?
Not specifically. There may be many different views in the broader Victorian community. I wouldn't doubt that, given the seriousness and the significance of these issues. But I want the answers that we all need, and I think the board has a critical role to play in that.
So, Premier, I want to put to you that the net effect of those three stages that we've looked at, the 27th of June, the 9th of July, and then the 27th of July, is pretty clear evidence that, in fact, the government did identify relevant aspects of the program that had created the opportunity for problems, and in particular for the outbreaks that occurred. Do you accept that?
I think, yes, I don't think that's unreasonable. I think that there's some risks are well known and well understood, and you do your level best to try and manage those. But it's it's not a conclusive list of issues, and that's why I've made it clear, Ms. Elliard, that when it comes to return travellers, I want to see the board's report before I settle on, or our government settles on, a final model.
Firstly, I want to submit to you that what clearly emerges from those documents and the decisions that the government has taken since late June is the recognition that there needs to be a much greater focus on clinical matters and greater involvement of medical clinical expertise. Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Secondly, the documentation indicates the need for an appropriate workforce, a workforce with the skill sets and supports that make them the right ones for the jobs that need to be done in hotel quarantine. Do you accept that?
Yes.
And thirdly, those documents reflect a recognition within government that there's a need for a clear line of control and the actual active exercise of that control by whoever has been nominated as the one in charge.
Yes.
So isn't that the answer? Isn't that what went wrong? The absence of those three things?
Well, the absence of those things and potentially other factors may well have contributed to this. I'm happy, if it's useful to the board, for me to provide commentary. I'm happy to do that, but I think that all of those matters, at least all of those matters, and potentially others that are not necessarily apparent to me and the government, may well have contributed to the fact that a program designed to contain the virus did not contain the virus. But again, I would just stress, Ms. Elliard, I want to be helpful, but I also want to see the report that this board of inquiry will hand down, because I think you have a much deeper understanding of these matters than what we do.
We could take a 15-minute break now and give you a break, or we could continue. So my inquiry of you is whether or not you're content to continue now or prefer a short break.
And we're halfway through Daniel Andrews giving evidence with the hotel inquiry. We're going to take a quick break. Stay with us. We'll be back right after this.
Madam Chair, I'm content to continue and given the lateness of the hour.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If the witness could be shown, come on the screen, the document, which is USG 0001 0016 0001, which is the interview with Lee Sales on the ABC 7:30 program on the 1st of July 2020. And it's on page 1 of the document, and you'll see, Mr. Andrews, it's the second time you appear on that page. So you'll see, first of all, you've said in response to a question from the presenter, well, I think the first point to make is that there's been some infection control breaches in Victoria that have not occurred in New South Wales. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, Mr. Moses.
Yes, thank you. And if the operator could then take us to page 2, which is the second time that you appear on that page. And what you see there in what's attributed to you, it's recorded that you said this in the third paragraph. We have some very clear suspicions about what's gone on here. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. I'll give you one example. We think one of these outbreaks may be attributable to people sharing a cigarette lighter, something as innocent as that. This thing is so widely infectious that it only takes one, and that if that person who's infected then goes and is part of a large family, that large family meets with other large families, all of a sudden you've got an outbreak and you get to the position we're in now. You see that?
Yes, I do.
Now, Mr. Andrews, in relation to your statement to Ms. Sales that we have some very clear suspicions about what's going on here. There are a number of staff who, despite knowing about infection control protocols, have decided to make a number of errors. Can you recall sitting here today who provided you with that information?
I can't provide you with a specific briefing or document, I could speak to my usual practice when drawing such conclusions in relation to the virus, Mr. Moses, if that would help.
No, what I'd like to learn, and your counsel may want to ask you those questions, but what I'd like to know is, sitting here today, do you have a recollection as where that information may have come from?
My only recollection is that will not, I think, have come from one single source, Mr. Moses. It will have come from multiple sources as a result of contact tracing, chains of transmission, and other information that is provided to me on a routine basis, much of which we don't identify to an individual for obvious privacy reasons. I can't provide you with a name. No, I can't.
And it's important also to ensure that persons are not blamed for causing the outbreak in breach of infection control procedures unless that conduct has actually occurred, correct?
I think that's fair, yes.
And as Council Sisting has taken you to, you in November 2018, of course, October 2018, set up the review into private security in Victoria, correct?
Yes.
And the reason you did that was in order to ensure that workers were paid properly and fairly, because you were concerned that they are amongst the most lowly paid workers, correct?
Correct.
Yes. And you wanted to ensure, of course, that those workers who are amongst the most marginalised because they undertake casual work were treated fairly, correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And can we assume that in respect of your views as set out in this transcript that I've taken you to, these were views that you formed based on information that you were told rather than anything you know firsthand, correct?
That's correct. Yes. Yes, that's correct, Mr. Moses.
Yes, thank you. And when did you find out about the outbreaks at the Ridges Hotel in May?
I would have been informed on or about the time the outbreak became clear via testing, tracing, and the normal work that I am briefed on routinely and that I report to the public daily.
Thank you. And can you tell us this? After you made the statement to Ms. Sales on the 1st of July 2020, did you have any conversations with Ms. Peake, who Council Sisting has told us was reporting to you, as to how this outbreak occurred?
Not that I specifically recall. No detailed conversation directly with her, no.
Thank you. And do you know whether anybody briefed you after the 1st of July about what, in fact, infection control protocols had been put in place by the Department of Health and Human Services at the Ridges?
Specifically at the Ridges, Mr. Moses?
Correct.
No, I couldn't attest to that. I couldn't recall that level of detail, no.
Okay, thank you.
There's only one question that I have for the Premier, and that concerns the fact that he's been asked a great many questions this afternoon concerning the operation of the hotel quarantine program, and arising from those questions and the evidence that he's given, it might be that he may have some perhaps reflections concerning the operation of the program, and if that would assist you, Madam Chair, I'd seek to ask him whether he would give you the benefit personally of his personal reflection.
Yes, I'll allow you to do that, Mr. O'Mara.
Madam Chair, if I can briefly make a couple of very important points. Mistakes have been made in this program and answers are required. Those mistakes are unacceptable to me. I want to thank you, Madam Chair, and the Board of Inquiry and all of your staff for the work that you are doing and will do. I want to make it very clear to each and every member of the Victorian community that I am sorry for what has occurred here. And I want to issue an unreserved apology to all Victorians. And I want to say to you, Madam Chair, that I await your final report, the conclusion of your work, so that we can understand better what has occurred, and so that I, as the Leader of the Government, can take the appropriate action to ensure that these sorts of errors never occur again.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I would ask that the Premier be excused with the inquiries. Thanks. That's the end of his evidence.